Hello my dear friends, welcome to Hauntra. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you don't miss any exciting coming up videos. Story 1, The Shadow of Pinecrest. Emily and her family moved to Pinecrest, a quiet, isolated town surrounded by thick forests. Their new home, an old Victorian house, had an eerie charm, with creaky wooden floors and a vast, overgrown garden. While exploring the house, Emily discovered a dusty attic filled with forgotten relics. Among them was a small, hand-carved wooden box with strange symbols etched on it. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it to find a locket containing a faded photograph of a young girl. That night, she dreamt of the girl standing at the edge of the woods, silently staring at her. The atmosphere in the house felt colder the next morning, but Emily brushed it off. Her parents were too busy unpacking to notice her unease. She decided to explore the garden, still clutching the mysterious locket. The garden backed to a dense forest that locals called the Whispering Woods. Emily felt an inexplicable pull toward the woods, as if something was calling her. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. As she ventured deeper, she heard faint whispers that seemed to float on the breeze. She spun around, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, and she could make out words like "leave" and "danger." Panicking, she turned to run, but tripped over an exposed root. When she looked up, she saw the girl from the photograph standing a few feet away. The girl vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind a chilling sense of dread. Emily sprinted back to the house, heart pounding. That evening, Emily confided in her neighbor, Mrs. Green, an elderly woman with a kind but serious demeanor. When Emily described the locket and the girl, Mrs. Green's face went pale. She warned Emily to stay away from the woods, recounting stories of children who had disappeared there over the years. She claimed the locket belonged to a girl named Lila, who had vanished decades ago. Skeptical but shaken, Emily decided to return the locket to the attic. As she climbed the stairs, the air grew heavy, and a sense of unease settled over her. She placed the locket back in the box, but the whispers from the woods echoed faintly in her ears. That night, Emily struggled to sleep, haunted by thoughts of Lila. Emily woke up to the sound of faint knocking on her bedroom window. Her room was on the second floor, making the noise impossible. Trembling, she crept toward the window, but saw nothing outside except the swaying trees. As she turned back, a shadowy figure loomed in the corner of her room. The figure whispered her name in a voice that sent shivers down her spine. Paralyzed with fear, Emily shut her eyes and screamed. When her parents rushed in and turned on the lights, the shadow was gone. They dismissed her experience as a bad dream, but Emily knew it was real. She decided to avoid the attic and the woods altogether. The next day, strange things started happening around the house. Doors creaked open and slammed shut on their own. Objects moved from their places, and the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms. Emily noticed that the disturbances were strongest near the attic. She tried to ignore it, but the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Her younger brother, Max, also claimed to see a shadowy figure watching him from the garden. Emily decided to tell her parents, but they dismissed it as their imaginations running wild. Desperate for answers, she returned to Mrs. Green, who gave her a solemn look and suggested contacting a historian who knew the town's dark past. Emily and Mrs. Green visited Mr. Harris, the town historian, who lived in a small cottage filled with old books and maps. Mr. Harris explained that the woods were once the site of a tragic incident involving a witch trial. Lila, the girl in the photograph, was the daughter of one of the accused women. She disappeared the night her mother was executed, and locals believed her spirit haunted the woods, seeking justice. The locket, he said, was a conduit for Lila's restless soul. Emily felt a mix of fear and guilt, realizing she had disturbed something far beyond her understanding. Mr. Harris warned her to destroy the locket if she wanted to end the hauntings. Determined to end the nightmare, Emily decided to burn the locket. She built a small fire in the garden under Mrs. Green's watchful eye. As the flames consumed the locket, an unearthly scream pierced the air, echoing from the woods. The fire roared unnaturally high, and a gust of wind extinguished it abruptly. When Emily looked at the ashes, the locket was still intact. Mrs. Green muttered a prayer, visibly shaken. Emily realized the locket couldn't be destroyed so easily and that she needed to find another way. That night, Max started acting strangely. He spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, repeating phrases like, "She won't leave," and "The woods are alive." Emily found him drawing symbols on the walls with charcoal, the same symbols carved on the locket. When she tried to stop him, he looked at her with empty black eyes and whispered, "You shouldn't have opened it." Her parents, now alarmed, called a doctor, but Max returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Emily knew Lila's spirit had latched on to her family and was growing stronger. The next morning, Emily discovered more of the strange symbols etched into the walls of the house, particularly near the attic door. The carvings were deep, as if done with great force, but no one had heard a sound during the night. Max's behavior worsened. He seemed distant, speaking in whispers and staring blankly at corners of the house. Emily noticed that wherever he sat, the air felt colder and the lights flickered. Desperate, Emily tried to scrub the symbols off the walls, but they wouldn't fade. Her mother, now visibly worried, suggested leaving the house for a few days, but her father dismissed the idea. Emily felt the house tightening its grip on her family. Emily decided to confront the source of the terror by returning to the woods. She felt drawn to the spot where she had first seen Lila. Carrying a flashlight and a protective charm Mrs. Green had given her, Emily ventured into the dense forest at dusk. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing, surrounding her as she pushed forward. Suddenly, she stumbled upon an old moss-covered stone altar with the same symbols carved into it. As she approached, she felt a cold hand brush her arm. She turned to see Lila's spectral figure, her face filled with sorrow and rage. Emily screamed and ran back toward the house, the whispers following her. Emily found an old diary hidden in the attic, written by one of the house's previous owners. The entries detailed strange occurrences and ended abruptly, suggesting the family had fled the house. One entry described the stone altar in the woods as a place where dark rituals were performed to bind spirits. It mentioned a ritual to free trapped souls, but warned of severe consequences if performed incorrectly. Emily realized the spirit of Lila wasn't just haunting them, it was trapped and seeking release. With no other choice, she decided to attempt the ritual, despite the risks. As Emily prepared for the ritual, the house grew increasingly hostile. Windows shattered without cause, and the walls groaned as if alive. Max's possession worsened. He spoke in Lila's voice, begging for help, but also threatening harm if they failed. Emily's parents were overwhelmed, but Emily convinced them to trust her. She gathered the required items: candles, salt, and herbs for Mrs. Green. That night, as a storm brewed outside, Emily and her family set up the ritual space in the living room. They could hear the whispers grow louder, as if the forest itself was closing in on them. Emily lit the candles and placed the locket in the center of the circle. She began reciting the incantation from the diary, her voice trembling. The whispers turned into wails, shaking the walls and extinguishing some of the candles. Max convulsed, screaming in Lila's voice, "You cannot free me." The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with despair and anger. Emily persisted, her voice growing louder to drown out the chaos. The locket began to glow, and for a moment, she saw Lila's face, tear-streaked and desperate. The moment Emily completed the incantation, the room went silent. Then, a deafening scream erupted as Lila's spirit materialized, her form twisting with pain and fury. She reached out toward Emily, who felt a sharp, icy pain shoot through her chest. Max collapsed, gasping for air as if freed from the possession. Emily's parents screamed, frozen in terror. Lila's ghost whispered, "It's not over," before vanishing into the locket, which shattered into pieces. The house shook violently, as though rejecting their presence. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The symbols on the walls had disappeared, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. Max had no memory of his possession, but was weak and disoriented. Emily explained everything to her parents, who finally believed her. They decided to leave Pinecrest immediately, abandoning the house and its haunting past. As they packed, Emily felt a lingering sadness, knowing that Lila's spirit was not at peace. She kept the shattered locket pieces as a reminder of the ordeal. The family moved to a small, modern house in a bustling town far from Pinecrest. Life slowly returned to normal, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, she sometimes heard faint whispers, though they were nothing like before. She buried the locket pieces in the backyard, hoping to leave the past behind. Mrs. Green wrote her a letter, urging her to stay vigilant and avoid anything connected to the woods. Emily promised herself she would never open another mysterious box. One evening, Emily found a note tucked under her pillow, written in a child's handwriting, "Thank you." Startled, she asked her family if they had left it, but they denied it. She realized it must have been from Lila, a sign of gratitude. Emily felt a bittersweet relief, knowing she had helped in some way. However, the note also served as a reminder that the woods still held secrets she might never uncover. She burned the note to sever any lingering ties. Months later, Emily was walking home from school when she saw a figure at the edge of the woods near her new town. It looked like Lila, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination or a warning. That night, she dreamt of Lila standing in the woods, smiling faintly before turning and disappearing into the trees. Emily woke up with tears in her eyes, feeling a sense of closure. Emily focused on rebuilding her life, throwing herself into school and new friendships. Though she couldn't forget the ordeal, she found strength in the experience. Her family also seemed happier, their bond stronger after surviving the haunting. Emily occasionally felt the urge to return to Pinecrest, but fear held her back. She vowed to live her life without letting the past define her. Years later, Emily visited Pinecrest on a whim. Finding the old house abandoned and overgrown, she stood at the edge of the whispering woods, listening for the familiar whispers, but hearing only the wind. As she turned to leave, she felt a faint, cold breeze brush her cheek, like a farewell. Emily smiled sadly, whispering, "Goodbye, Lila," before walking away. Though the shadow of Pinecrest lingered in her memory, she knew it would never control her again. Story 2. The Forgotten Crypt. In the small town of Willowbrook, a decrepit graveyard lay forgotten at the edge of town. Locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, but to 17-year-old Daniel and his friends, it was the perfect place for a dare. The graveyard was overgrown with weeds, and many of the tombstones were cracked or illegible. At its center stood a crumbling mausoleum with a heavy iron gate chained shut. The air around it felt colder, and a faint odor of decay lingered. That evening, Daniel's best friend Alex dared him to spend the night inside the graveyard. Daniel, ever the skeptic, laughed and accepted, brushing off warnings about the curse. As the sun set, he entered the graveyard alone with his flashlight, sleeping bag, and snacks. The iron gate creaked as it closed behind him, sounding like a warning. As darkness fell, Daniel set up his sleeping bag near a cluster of tombstones. The graveyard was eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. He tried to relax, scrolling through his phone, but soon the signal vanished. That's when he heard it. A faint whisper, like someone muttering his name. He froze, shining his flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. Nervous, he shouted, "Who's there?" but was met with silence. Convinced it was Alex trying to scare him, Daniel ignored it and lay down. The whispers returned, this time louder, seeming to come from the mausoleum. His flashlight flickered briefly, and a cold wind swept through the graveyard. Unable to shake his unease, Daniel decided to investigate the mausoleum. The iron gate was still chained shut, but the whispers grew louder as he approached. He leaned in to peer through the gate, his breath fogging up the chilly air. The interior was pitch black, but he swore he saw movement, like a shadow shifting. Just as he was about to step back, the chain rattled violently, as if someone was trying to open it from the inside. Startled, Daniel stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. When he picked it up, the mausoleum door was ajar. His heart raced as he debated whether to go inside or leave the graveyard altogether. Curiosity won over fear, and Daniel pushed open the gate. The air inside was thick and foul, carrying the scent of damp stone and decay. The walls were lined with niches holding dusty coffins, some with lids slightly askew. At the center of the room was a stone altar covered in strange, faded symbols. As Daniel stepped closer, he felt a sudden dizziness, as if the room itself were spinning. A sharp, cold breeze swept past him, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. He turned to leave, but found the door closed and the chain re-wrapped around the gate. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. Daniel tugged at the gate, but the chain wouldn't budge. He banged on the door, shouting for help, but the graveyard remained silent. His flashlight began to flicker more frequently, casting long, dancing shadows across the crypt walls. He heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him and spun around, shining the light into the darkness. For a brief moment, he saw a figure, a tall, shadowy shape with hollow eyes, standing near the altar. When he blinked, it was gone. Heart pounding, he backed against the gate, desperate for a way out. Daniel's breathing grew ragged as the temperature in the crypt plummeted. Suddenly, a coffin lid creaked open, and he watched in horror as a skeletal hand emerged. The whispers escalated into moans, filling the space with a cacophony of voices. The skeletal figure dragged itself out of the coffin, its empty eye sockets fixed on Daniel. Frozen in place, he couldn't scream or move as it staggered toward him. Just as it reached out, the crypt was flooded with an otherworldly glow, and the figure dissolved into mist. Daniel collapsed to his knees, trembling. Gathering his courage, Daniel explored the crypt further, hoping to find an escape. Near the altar, he discovered an old leather-bound journal, partially hidden under rubble. The pages were brittle, but still legible, written in a language he didn't recognize. Scattered among the entries were disturbing sketches of rituals and shadowy figures. In the margins, someone had scribbled warnings in English. "Do not disturb the altar," and "The cursed guardian watches." Daniel felt a chill as he realized he might have triggered something by entering the crypt. He stuffed the journal into his backpack, hoping it would provide answers later. The whispers abruptly stopped, plunging the crypt into an unsettling silence. Daniel felt an oppressive presence, and when he turned, the shadowy figure from before stood inches away. It towered over him, its hollow eyes radiating malice. It didn't move, but exuded a suffocating energy that made it hard for Daniel to breathe. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the altar. A deep, guttural voice echoed in his mind. "Return what you've taken." Daniel realized it meant the journal, but fear rooted him in place. Daniel bolted toward the gate, clutching the journal. To his astonishment, the chain fell away as he approached, and the gate swung open. He sprinted out of the mausoleum and into the graveyard, the whispers rising to a deafening roar behind him. The air outside felt no safer. Shadows seemed to dart between the tombstones, and the ground felt unstable beneath his feet. As he neared the graveyard's entrance, he tripped over an exposed root and fell hard. Glancing back, he saw the shadowy figure emerging from the mausoleum, its movements slow but deliberate. Daniel burst into his house, slamming the door behind him. His parents, startled by his disheveled appearance, demanded an explanation, but he couldn't find the words. Exhausted, he retreated to his room, hiding the journal under his bed. That night, he dreamt of the crypt and the shadowy figure, its voice whispering, "You cannot escape." When he woke, the journal was lying open on his desk, despite him not touching it. A new entry had appeared, written in shaky handwriting, "You are marked." Daniel stared at the journal, his heart pounding as he reread the ominous words, "You are marked." His room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. He flipped through the journal, searching for clues. Among the strange symbols, he found a sketch resembling the mausoleum with a note. "The guardian is bound to its altar, but will hunt those who disturb it." He noticed a faint, circular mark on his wrist that burned slightly. Daniel tried scrubbing it off, but it wouldn't fade. He realized this wasn't over. The crypt's curse had followed him home. That night, Daniel experienced vivid nightmares. He was back in the crypt, the guardian's hollow eyes fixed on him as skeletal hands emerged from the walls. The whispers were louder, almost deafening, and the air grew suffocatingly thick. He woke in a cold sweat, only to find the whispers still faintly audible in his room. His flashlight, which he hadn't touched, flickered on and off by itself. A shadow moved across the ceiling, and when he looked closely, it took the shape of the guardian's figure. Trembling, Daniel vowed to return the journal and end the curse. Daniel confided in Alex and their friend Sarah, who had an interest in the paranormal. Sarah examined the journal, recognizing some symbols as protective wards used in ancient rituals. "You disrupted a binding spell," she explained. "The guardian wasn't just protecting the crypt, it was containing something." Alex suggested burning the journal, but Sarah warned that might worsen the curse. Together, they decided to return the journal to the crypt and attempt to restore the binding spell. Despite his fear, Daniel agreed. It was the only way to stop the guardian from haunting him. The trio waited until midnight to avoid being seen. The graveyard was even more ominous than Daniel remembered. Shrouded in thick fog, Alex carried a crowbar to defend them, while Sarah clutched a book of rituals she'd brought for guidance. As they approached the mausoleum, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The gate creaked open on its own, as if inviting them inside. Sarah hesitated, sensing an overwhelming malevolence, but Daniel urged her forward. They stepped into the crypt, the temperature plummeting instantly. The guardian's shadow loomed near the altar, waiting. As soon as they entered, the guardian appeared, its hollow eyes glowing brighter than before. It raised an arm, and the crypt trembled, dislodging pieces of stone from the walls. Sarah shouted for Daniel to place the journal on the altar, but the guardian blocked his path. It spoke directly into their minds. "You have trespassed. You cannot undo what has been unleashed." Alex swung the crowbar at the figure, but it passed through harmlessly, the metal corroding instantly. The guardian advanced, forcing them to retreat toward the walls. Sarah flipped through her ritual book, frantically searching for the right incantation. She instructed Daniel to place the journal on the altar while she prepared a salt circle for protection. The guardian seemed to sense her intent and lashed out, sending a cold gust that extinguished their flashlight. In near darkness, Sarah began chanting, her voice trembling but steady. Daniel felt the mark on his wrist burn fiercely as he placed the journal on the altar. The crypt seemed to come alive, with the whispers merging into a single, agonized scream. The guardian's form grew more distinct, its skeletal features and clawed hands becoming visible. It lashed out again, shattering the salt circle and knocking Alex to the ground. Sarah shouted for Daniel to hold the journal down as she completed the binding chant. The guardian roared, its voice shaking the crypt, and the walls began to crack. Shadows swirled violently around them, and Daniel felt as though the mark on his wrist was pulling him into the altar. Just as the guardian lunged, Sarah shouted the final word of the incantation, and a blinding light filled the crypt. When the light subsided, the crypt was eerily quiet. The guardian had vanished, and the journal lay closed on the altar. The mark on Daniel's wrist faded, leaving only a faint scar. Sarah inspected the altar and confirmed that the binding spell seemed to have worked. The trio hurried out of the crypt, the gate slamming shut behind them as if sealing the curse once more. For the first time, the graveyard felt still, no longer haunted by the oppressive whispers. They left without looking back, relieved to be alive. Back at home, Daniel finally felt at ease, though he couldn't shake the memory of the crypt. The journal remained in the mausoleum, but the faint scar on his wrist served as a reminder of their ordeal. Sarah warned him that while the binding spell was restored, the crypt would remain dangerous if disturbed again. Alex, trying to lighten the mood, joked about selling their story to a paranormal TV show. Daniel laughed weakly, but deep down, he knew they'd narrowly escaped something far worse. Months later, a construction crew arrived at the graveyard to demolish the mausoleum, unaware of its history. Daniel read about it in the news and felt a pang of dread. That night, he dreamt of the guardian again, standing outside his window. It said only one thing: the seal is broken. He woke in terror, realizing the curse was far from over. As the story spread across town, whispers of strange occurrences at the construction site began to circulate. Daniel knew the guardian would not rest again. Story 3. The Watcher in the Woods. Rachel and her friends decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the woods, far from the bustling city. The cabin was a cozy, rustic structure surrounded by thick pine trees, offering an escape from their busy lives. It was the perfect getaway, until the sun set. As night approached, an eerie quietness settled in, and they found themselves in complete darkness, except for the cabin's dimly lit interior. The woods surrounding the cabin seemed to press in closer as shadows shifted. They laughed it off, but an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. That night, while they sat around the fire, strange noises echoed from the forest. A series of twigs snapping, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing. At first, they thought it was an animal, but the sounds were far too close for comfort. Rachel peered out into the darkness, her heart racing. Nothing was visible, but the sounds persisted, growing louder. The friends dismissed it as the wind or perhaps a deer. Still, something felt off. The air felt colder, and every gust of wind made the trees creak ominously. Unable to sleep, Rachel lay in bed listening to the sounds outside. Her mind kept replaying the noises, which had seemed so deliberate, almost like someone was walking just beyond the trees. She decided to go outside to check. Standing on the porch, she called out to the woods, her voice trembling, but received no response. As she turned to go back inside, she caught a glimpse of something tall and dark moving swiftly between the trees. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she looked again, it was gone. The next morning, Rachel mentioned what she saw, but her friends shrugged it off as a trick of the light. However, the unease lingered in the group. As the day wore on, the forest around them seemed to grow even quieter. There were no sounds of birds or animals, only an eerie stillness that left them feeling watched. Rachel tried to enjoy the beauty of the woods, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was lurking just out of sight. The sensation was overwhelming, and her friends began to notice it too. Rachel decided to explore the forest alone to calm her nerves. As she wandered deeper into the woods, she stumbled upon something odd, an old, weathered cabin hidden among the trees, completely abandoned. The door was ajar, creaking in the wind, and the windows were cracked, revealing dark, empty interiors. Something about the cabin gave off an eerie feeling, as though it had been untouched for years, yet there were no signs of nature reclaiming it. As she examined the surroundings, she found strange symbols carved into the doorframe. Rachel returned to the cabin and shared her discovery with the others, but they were skeptical. Still, they agreed to visit the abandoned cabin the next morning. When they arrived, they found the door shut tight, as if it had never been open. The symbols Rachel had seen were gone, and the cabin looked normal. The group tried to brush it off as a trick of their imagination, but they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. As they were about to leave, Rachel found a piece of paper hidden beneath a rock. It read, "Stay out of the woods after dark." That night, as they sat inside the cabin, an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, began to echo from the woods. It was too precise, too methodical to be an animal. Rachel and her friends looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. As they gathered around the windows, they could make out vague, shifting figures among the trees. Something was moving out there, watching them. Panic began to set in, but no one dared speak the words they were all thinking. They were not alone. The next day, Sarah, one of Rachel's friends, went missing. The group assumed she had gone for a walk, or perhaps wandered off to explore the woods, but hours passed without any sign of her. Rachel and the others searched the area frantically, calling her name, but there was no response. The forest seemed to close in around them, its silence almost mocking their efforts. Just as they were about to give up, they found Sarah's backpack, untouched and resting against a tree, but there was no sign of her. That evening, after a long day of searching, they returned to the cabin, exhausted and on edge. As night fell, a strange tapping began at the windows, soft at first, then louder. It sounded like fingers drumming against the glass. Rachel rushed to the window, but saw nothing in the dark. When she turned back to the room, a figure stood in the doorway. The figure was tall, with hollow eyes and a gaunt, pale face. Before she could scream, it vanished into the night. Rachel finally realized what they were dealing with. The figure in the woods was no ordinary person. It was something that had been lurking in these woods for decades, maybe even centuries. She recalled the warning on the piece of paper. Stay out of the woods after dark. The old cabin, the symbols, Sarah's disappearance, all of it fit together. The figure they had seen wasn't human. It was the Watcher, a malevolent entity that had claimed the forest as its domain. The friends were no longer guests in the woods. They were its prey. That night, Rachel and the remaining friends barricaded themselves inside the cabin. The sounds from the woods grew louder. Footsteps, whispers, and faint cries that seemed to come from all directions. Each noise made them jump, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they were being watched. The shadowy figure was out there somewhere, just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. But as the hours passed, the terror became more than just a feeling. It was a presence, something closing in on them. They could no longer escape. The next morning, they discovered something horrifying. A message written on the walls of the cabin in what appeared to be blood. The letters were jagged, as if carved into the wood with great force. "You belong to me now." The friends tried to stay calm, but panic was rising. Sarah had vanished, and now this. A clear sign that the Watcher was making his presence known in the most horrifying way. Rachel felt the walls closing in, the weight of the curse they had unknowingly triggered. They had been warned, but it was too late to turn back. In the attic, Rachel found an old, dusty journal hidden in a box. As she flipped through its pages, she realized it had once belonged to someone who had stayed in the cabin decades ago. The journal spoke of strange occurrences, sights of shadowy figures in the woods, whispers in the night, and the ever-present Watcher. The writer had tried to escape but had failed, just as Rachel and her friends were now. The final entry was chilling. "It's too late for me now. He watches. He always watches." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. The writer had been the Watcher's previous victim. As Rachel read the journal aloud to the others, the temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The friends scrambled to their feet, their hearts racing. They could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the cabin, growing louder and closer with each passing moment. Someone, or something, was outside, just beyond the door. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the darkness, "You can never leave." The friends were trapped, and the forest was closing in. They knew that escaping wasn't an option. The figure would catch them, and there was nowhere to hide. In a desperate attempt to fight back, they armed themselves with anything they could find. A rusted knife from the kitchen, a broken chair leg, and a fire poker. Rachel was shaking, but she knew they had to make a stand, even if it was a futile one. The door creaked open, and they heard a voice that sounded almost too human, calling their names in a mocking tone. The door finally opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was the Watcher. The figure was tall and skeletal, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Its face was an empty mask of darkness, its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. It stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, its long bony fingers reaching out toward them. The air grew thick with a foul, metallic scent, and the temperature dropped even further. The friends were paralyzed with terror, unable to move or scream. Rachel lunged forward, swinging the broken chair leg at the creature. It moved with a speed that seemed impossible for its lanky frame, dodging her attack effortlessly. The others tried to fight back, but every strike was useless. Nothing could harm it. The creature's laughter echoed in the cabin, filling their ears with a maddening sound. It seemed to enjoy their fear, feeding off of it. Rachel felt her strength fading as the creature drew closer. She could hear it whispering her name. As the creature drew closer, Rachel realized that there was only one way to survive. She had to make a deal. Desperately, she whispered the words the creature seemed to be waiting for. "What do you want?" The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. It spoke softly, "A soul for a soul." Without hesitation, Rachel offered her life in exchange for her friends. The Watcher seemed to smile, its eyes flashing with a terrible hunger. She had made her choice, but would it be enough? In an instant, the Watcher's form lunged at Rachel. its icy fingers gripping her. But just as quickly, the air around them seemed to shift, the shadows receding. Rachel felt herself being pulled away, as though the ground beneath her feet was vanishing. When she opened her eyes, she was outside the cabin alone. The watcher was gone, but so were her friends. She had escaped, but at a great cost. Rachel was free, but the forest would never let her forget. Years passed, but Rachel never spoke of that night again. She moved far away, trying to live a normal life. But sometimes, when she would walk through a dark forest or hear a twig snap, she could feel it. The watcher's presence, just beyond the trees. It would always be there, waiting for her to return. And she knew deep down that she would never truly escape the woods or the price she had paid. The watcher still watched, and the forest was still hungry. Story 4: The Silent Caller. It started with a strange phone call late one evening. Amanda was alone in her apartment, finishing up some work when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and when she answered, there was only silence on the other end. After a few seconds, a faint breath was heard, followed by a click as the line disconnected. She shrugged it off, assuming it was a wrong number or some telemarketer. But as she tried to focus on her work, her phone rang again. Same number. This time, the silence lasted longer. Amanda's unease grew. For the next few days, the calls continued, always at odd hours. Amanda could hear breathing on the other side, sometimes slow and labored, other times quick and frantic. No one ever spoke, but it was as if the caller was watching her. It wasn't just the oddity of the calls, but the timing. They came when Amanda was at her most vulnerable, when she was alone, when she was just about to sleep. Each time the phone rang, her heart would race in anticipation of the silence that followed. She tried changing her number, but the calls kept coming. After a week of silent calls, Amanda received a text message from the same unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "I know what you did." Amanda's mind raced. What could this person know? The message left her feeling exposed, paranoid, and afraid to leave her apartment. She looked over her shoulder constantly, fearing that someone might be watching from outside. But who? The silence had turned into something more sinister, something personal. Amanda was no longer sure if she was alone. Days passed, and the calls and texts grew more frequent. Amanda began to feel like she was being stalked, but she had no proof. She would sometimes hear faint scratching sounds coming from the windows at night, but when she looked outside, there was nothing. Still, the sensation of being watched never left her. One night, while watching TV, Amanda noticed a shadow moving outside her window. She froze, heart pounding. The silhouette of a figure lingered, but when she blinked, it was gone. The next day, the caller rang again, the silence as suffocating as ever. Amanda couldn't take it anymore. Sleep-deprived and terrified, she went to the police. But when she explained the situation, the officers dismissed it as a prank. They told her that anyone could change their phone number or disguise their voice, and there was no concrete threat to investigate. Amanda was left feeling even more helpless. As she walked home, the streets felt darker than ever, and she could almost hear someone's footsteps behind her, matching her pace. She quickened her step, her breath shallow and fast. In an attempt to escape, Amanda decided to take a weekend trip to visit her grandmother in the countryside. She thought a change of scenery would help her clear her head and escape the constant calls. But even here, the phone rang. She ignored it at first, but then the message came. "I'm already here." The breath in her ear made her drop her phone. Looking out the window, she noticed an old, abandoned house across the field, its dark windows staring back at her. It felt as if the caller was closer than ever. Back home, the calls became more unsettling. The unknown voice began to speak, but not in complete sentences. "I see you at the store. I saw you walking with him." Amanda's heart sank. It was as if the caller knew every move she made. She couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on her, like the caller was everywhere. Her life was no longer her own, and the fear she felt was palpable. She started carrying pepper spray and checking every door and window before bed. One afternoon, Amanda came home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Panic surged through her as she stepped inside. Everything seemed to be in place. But when she checked the key bowl, she noticed her spare key was missing. She had never given anyone access to her apartment, and she had locked the door when she left that morning. Someone had been inside. She felt an overwhelming sense of violation, knowing that the person watching her had been closer than ever. She couldn't trust her own space anymore. Amanda's growing paranoia led her to install cameras in her apartment. One evening, she watched the footage in horror. There, in the corner of the frame, a shadowy figure was standing by the window. The figure never moved, never spoke, just stood there, watching. The footage showed it for hours, then fading away when Amanda returned home. She called the police again, but they couldn't identify the figure. Whoever it was had evaded capture. The silence was only growing more suffocating. One night, Amanda received a final message from the caller. It simply read, "You're next." The message felt like a death sentence. That was the last straw. Amanda decided to leave the city and disappear, hoping that a fresh start would end the nightmare. As she packed her things, she heard a faint knock on her door. When she opened it, there was no one there, only a single red rose on the doorstep. The message was clear. The watcher was still out there, and he was never going to stop. Amanda left the city the very next day, seeking refuge in a quiet town far from her past. She found a small cottage and tried to settle in, hoping the fresh air and peaceful surroundings would calm her nerves. For a while, it seemed like the nightmare had ended. But every time she picked up her phone, she felt a pang of dread. The number was no longer unfamiliar. It had been blocked. But somehow, Amanda still felt the weight of the silent caller's presence. The calls had stopped, but the fear lingered in her heart, never truly gone. Amanda began to notice subtle signs that her peaceful life wasn't as safe as it seemed. Every time she went for a walk, she had the feeling of being watched. Sometimes she would catch a figure standing in the distance, half hidden behind trees. But when she approached, no one would be there. It was as if she was being stalked by the very fear that had followed her from the city. No phone calls, no messages, just the constant, creeping feeling of being observed. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. One night, as Amanda sat reading by the fire, her phone rang. The number was blocked, but she hesitated before answering. The moment she did, she heard the same slow, heavy breathing on the other end. "You thought you could escape," the voice whispered. Amanda's heart raced. She slammed the phone down, her hands shaking. It had followed her here, into this peaceful town. The terror was back. The silent caller had never left her. He had simply been waiting. That night, Amanda had a disturbing dream. She found herself standing in the middle of the same abandoned house she had seen in her nightmares before. The rooms were dark, the air thick with the smell of rot. As she wandered through the hallways, the silent caller appeared, his face obscured by a hood, standing motionless in the corner of the room. He didn't move, but she could feel his eyes on her. As she tried to run, the walls seemed to close in, trapping her inside. Amanda awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. The dream felt too real. The next morning, Amanda was shaken but tried to continue with her routine. She went outside to get some fresh air, but as she opened her door, she found another red rose on her doorstep. This time, there was a small card attached. "I know where you are." Amanda froze. The chill from the card seeped into her bones. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was psychological. Whoever this person was, they were toying with her. She picked up the rose, feeling like a pawn in a game she couldn't win. Determined to fight back, Amanda installed surveillance cameras all around her cottage. At first, everything seemed normal. But one evening, while watching the footage, she saw something that froze her in place. A shadowy figure had been creeping around her home for the past few nights, always hiding just out of the camera's view. Whoever it was knew exactly where to stand to avoid detection. Amanda's pulse quickened as she watched the footage, realizing the intruder had been closer than she had imagined. It was past midnight when the phone rang again. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she reluctantly picked it up. "I can hear you breathing," the voice said, his tone cold and mocking. "I know you're not alone." Amanda's blood ran cold as she realized the voice was coming from the very room she was in. She turned, her eyes darting around the dark space, her mind racing. She was alone, but was she? Amanda finally decided to confront her stalker. She waited up late one night, armed with a flashlight and a heavy stick. As the hours passed, she heard the familiar footsteps outside. Then the sound of a figure approaching her door. She flung it open, ready to strike. But there was no one there. Instead, she found a white mask lying on the ground. The mask stared up at her with hollow eyes, like a silent reminder that the stalker was closer than ever. Amanda decided to leave once again, this time for good. She packed her things and rushed to the bus station, but as she was about to board, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. It was the blocked number. She hesitated, but this time, she answered. "I'll always be with you," the voice whispered, sending a cold shiver down her spine. Amanda hung up, her hands trembling. It was as if the caller was everywhere, following her, even to this new place. Amanda never found peace. No matter where she went, the silent caller would always find her. She learned to live in a constant state of fear, looking over her shoulder and second-guessing every phone call. The calls stopped, but the messages, the roses, the masks, they never ceased. It was as if the caller had become a part of her life, and she would never be free of them. The silent caller had won. Amanda was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.